Hello everybody, this is Project Meatball, and today I'm going to walk you through how the game got to its current state as a baseline for devlogs going forward. So, one day over 2 years ago on my lunch break at work, I decided I wanted to make a casual browser-based RPG. So, I wrote up a design document detailing what the player can do, some formulas for combat, and for a few days I added to it, planning out how equipment, encounters, stats, etc. would work, even prototyping by making up some stats, running them through the formula, and writing down the numbers. I then proceeded to forget about the document, so for years, Unnamed Casual RPG Project was little more than this image and a lot of text on my Google Drive. Fast forward a couple of years, and this little thing called the coronavirus pandemic happened. You might have heard of it. I was furloughed, meaning I kept getting paid but wasn't allowed to work. So, I decided this was my time to shine. I started working on a top-down action game. I tried my hand at drawing some pixel art and created the monsters you're seeing on screen for the game. About a month in, and the lack of direction and planning started to get to me, killing my motivation, so I figured I'd take a break. Suddenly remembering this RPG combat system I had completed in pretty good detail on paper. Virtual paper, but you know what I mean. So, I decided to work on that. I started a new Unity project, created a combat scene, and got to work. I created a bunch of empty scripts with some public variables just so I could start attaching them to game objects and link them together to kind of give me an idea of what working with the finished scripts might feel like. I decided I want this RPG system to be very robust. Nothing will be hard-coded, and in theory, once I write all the scripts, I can make all the content in the game without writing any more code, even making a completely new game using the same assets. Eventually, I had placeholder scripts for characters, equipment, damage type, affinities, equipment slots, combat moves, a combat manager, and hooking them together felt good, even if they didn't actually do anything. If I gave the character game object an equipment slot and dragged an equipment item into it, it's basically equipped. Throw in some affinities and they've got stats. Next goal, of course, was to write some code to give things some basic functionality. I started with combat moves as they are the first real interaction that's going to happen. This required the characters to be able to take damage, scan all their affinities and equipment slots for attack and defense power per damage type, so it very quickly started taking shape. Once this was complete, I needed a targeting system, and for the combat manager to actually take into account whose turn it was. So, the time unit generation based on speed came next, with moves communicating to the manager that they're done, so the next person could go. At this point, it was starting to feel like a game, which was very exciting, but it would come to an abrupt end when it was a non-player character's turn, which meant the time had come to build some AI. I really want to go into detail on how this works at some point, but not today. That's probably a whole other video in and of itself. But suffice it to say, once that was complete, it really started to feel like a game. At this point, characters' health was hitting 0, so I needed to drop them out of combat when this happened. Time to update characters to check on themselves if they are alive, and have the combat and targeting managers ask the characters to prove they were alive before including them in anything. Now, this was all before I decided to stream the development and didn't really keep a record of what I was working on, so this is all from memory and I don't remember the exact order. But at this point I created status effects, added a timeline to track whose turn it's going to be at the top of the screen, and implemented scene transitions, which also meant creating the encounter system and an inventory. I only had scene transitions working one way at first, so I eventually added a battle end screen and implemented the reward loot system so you receive the new item in your inventory at the end of battle, before going back to the map. There were many issues at this stage, learning to keep track of what's loading and unloading on map change, how to keep things in memory across scene transitions was a huge pain in the butt, and I'd be lying if I said I was confident I'm not going to find more issues related to this down the line. Okay, so now it really feels like a game, but before adding any new mechanics, I wanted to prove the AI and status effect systems were expandable. So, I added a new type of AI condition and status effect that could look at or change a character's affinities respectively. This is when I started streaming development with the new Golden Wreath Games Twitch account, but I may have forgotten to save that recording on the first stream. At this point, the game is starting to have more or less every feature I wanted for the first prototype. All it was missing was the ability to save and load your game, and a main menu. So that was next. I decided that Prototype 1 isn't going to have experience points and leveling, and character growth will happen through equipping stronger gear. I'm not entirely sure that if this is the system I'm going with for the final version of the game, but that's what prototypes and playtesting is for. This meant that the only thing I needed to save was the inventory. Now in Unity, the usual way to store some variables is using player prefs, but I feel like I have far too much information to store for player prefs to be an option, so I went with C# binary serialization. To anyone who doesn't know, serialization just means changing data in such a way that it can be stored to a file, and read from that file. Thing is, I cannot serialize Unity objects, and truth be told, I probably didn't want to serialize entire equipment objects anyway. That would bloat the file size and probably complicate things if I ever changed the item's stats in a patch. So I had to come up with a system to give items a unique ID, which I can store in an array to record the player's inventory. I came up with a script that ran in the Unity editor, which, let me tell you, is terrifying stuff. Scripts run during edit mode can modify prefabs, scenes, you name it, but this bypasses any safety net you have, such as undoing, so it can really mess things up. Either way, what I did was I gave my equipment script an ID integer field, and created a manager that would list every equipment item in the game. Every time I added a new item to that list, it would give it a new ID, modify the equipment item's prefab, and make sure all instances of said item updated their ID too. It would then store the highest ID for the next item. This way, I didn't have to manually add an ID number to each equipment item when there are going to be so many. I'm both proud of this solution and also very worried I might have broken like 100 best practice guidelines, but who knows? Any experienced Unity developers watching this? Are you cringing? Let me know in the comments. I do plan on going into much greater detail on how saving works in the future, when I do some deep dives into the individual systems in play. And anyway, I got the inventory saving and loading, which was incredibly exciting, but it wasn't quite there yet. I needed to store what characters had what items equipped. I gave characters an ID, but seeing as there'd be far less playable characters than equipment items, I was happy to manually assign the IDs this time. I created a new class that worked like a one-to-many-to-one relationship, if you understand database talk anyway, and serialized this to store the equipment status. Seeing this work for the first time was emotional. Realizing that the game is feature complete for prototype release 1 was a feeling I will not soon forget. Game saved. All the stuff is in there. Is it gonna work? I'm nervous. I'm really nervous. Wait. Anyway, this is where we're at now. There is still loads to do before I can release a prototype, mainly polishing up some screens, removing some borrowed artwork, creating a lot more content, and a lot of bug fixing. It has just been myself on the project for the majority of the time, and while I do now have an artist slowly replacing my terrible programmer art, it's still just me working in Unity itself, and testing your own work is often not the best way of doing things, so I still come across a lot of little things that need fixing, and some not so little. Either way, I'll be adding new monsters and locations in the game, and will hopefully have a playable prototype to release on itch.io in the near future. Thank you so much for watching, and please consider subscribing, as I will be making regular devlogs going forward and other videos related to my game development journey. You can also follow Golden Wreath Games on Twitter and Twitch, links in the description below. I'll see you in the next update.